Just want to think about what the government's been doing for the past, I suppose, what is it, 5 weeks now since we've been locked away in our homes, and how did they manage to persuade us all to go for this? How did they manage to talk us all in to going into lockdown? Well, years ago I read a book by a man called Robert Cialdini, and it was called Persuasion, and he went through all these various steps that people use to persuade people. And I'm not going to go into them all. I mean, if you want to read it, go and buy the book, or even Google them. You can find out, I think, the 6 steps of persuasion. But you can absolutely be assured that the government's using every single one of them. Again, repeating over and over again the same mantra. That's really neuro-linguistic programming. And especially when you think about the way they're going about this, every time a government minister stands up and speaks, he makes sure that he's got a doctor, a scientific expert, a military man standing next to him. And the reason that they're doing that is because none of us trust politicians. None of us trust the people that are running the country. But what we do trust, we trust doctors, we trust military men, we used to trust police officers, but I think that's becoming less and less, sadly. But they're putting people that are authority figures up in front of us. They're also putting people that have a likability factor in front of us. And the other thing they're doing is they're congratulating us all on doing so well, and saying, well, look, if Mr. Jones is doing it, then Mr. Smith should be doing it. And all of those methods that they're using are brainwashing techniques. And like I say, get the book Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. Now, the reality is we don't know that what the government doing is having any effect whatsoever on what's happening with this virus in terms of how many people are going to die. Because sooner or later the lockdown will have to end, and if it's going to take as long as they think it is to get a vaccine, well, what's going to be left when the lockdown's finished? Now, I was not against the lockdown when it first started. I was worried about it, and I was questioning it, but I think now we're at a stage where they're not giving us a clear roadmap out of the lockdown. And they keep talking about these 5 principles, 5 pillars as they call them, funnily enough. That's a coincidence, isn't it? These 5 principles for getting out of lockdown. But they're not telling us when that will be. And what's happening all the time, confidence in the economy is becoming less and less and less. And people's jobs are evaporating. And let's look at their catchphrase. Stay at home, save the NHS, save lives. Or words to that effect, it might be the other way around. Well, let's turn that on its head and say, staying at home crashes the economy and costs lives. Let that be the lockdown rebellion catchphrase. Staying at home crashes the economy and costs lives. Because that is going to be what's going to happen. Now, I am not against, and I've said this time and time again, I'm not against social distancing. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I do believe there is a genuine virus that's a threat to probably every single one of us. But in the same way that I didn't agree with the government's advice when it came to terrorist attacks, when they were telling everybody to run, hide and tell, we've seen that every time there was a terrorist attack and somebody had to go and interrupted that terrorist attack, that it stopped the terrorist attack from happening. And exactly the same way, I am not, or no longer, in any way thinking that this lockdown is going to do anything other than crash the economy. And you know what's coming? You know what's coming? As soon as the economy is totally tanked, the liberal elites will be screaming, Brexit must be stopped. We can't afford Brexit now. This is going to be a disaster for our country. So what do we do? What do we do as normal people who aren't experts? We're not scientific experts. Well, I think we responsibly start rebelling against the lockdown. I'm not talking about we don't want to see anyone unnecessarily infected. We don't want to see people getting sick unnecessarily. But I think we start standing up against the lockdown. And we do start the lockdown rebellion, because the civil liberties implications of this are frightening. And when you think about how easily we all complied to this, or, well, I was certainly hoodwinked by it. But now I think we need to get to a stage where we're saying enough's enough. It's time for business to get back to normal. And of course, one of the other problems we've got is Boris Johnson, after his experience with this virus, is terrified, and you can understand it. I've had the virus. I know how unpleasant it is. Boris Johnson, after his experience with the virus, is terrified and doesn't want anyone else to go through that. It's a human emotion, we can understand that. But the reality is his decision making is now going to be marred because of the sickness that he went through. And like I say, I don't believe this is a conspiracy theory. I don't believe there's a big conspiracy behind this. But what I do believe is that what's happening at the moment is very damaging to civil liberties. It's very damaging to people's mental and physical health. And it's very damaging to the economy. And of course, if the economy tanks, there won't be an NHS to fight for. If the economy tanks, there won't be any money left for the NHS. If we end up in a situation where the economy GDP falls by 35%, that is an absolute catastrophe. And many of us will lose our jobs, our livelihoods, and will be reduced to beggar status. And I've worked the whole of my life. I worked on building sites when I left school. I was in the army for 7 years. I've worked in advertising and marketing for the past 25, 30 years. So I don't want to be in a situation where I'm out of a job because the government has made a bad decision, and where a lot more people suffer. The whole idea when we went into lockdown was to protect the NHS. In other words, to build up the capacity and the resilience of the NHS. We have more hospitals almost than we have people in a lot of places. So the capacity issue is no longer an argument. Once they get them all the protective equipment, once they get them all up to speed in these new COVID hospitals, surely to goodness we can start getting back to normality. And if it means wearing masks everywhere we go, then so be it. If it means restaurants can open but they're only allowed to let 10 people in at a time, so be it. A little bit of money is going to be better than no money whatsoever. So I think the government needs to really take a hard look at what they're doing, and is destroying the economy and wrecking the prospects of a generation of British people. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? And is it even saving lives? And they're questions that we've got to ask, and I don't think they've been asked. I mean, I'm in a beauty spot here. I deliberately came to this beauty spot because I had to get my car and drive to come here. It wasn't far from where I live. But if I lived in an inner city and I could get somewhere to somewhere like this, even if I had to drive for an hour, it would be worth doing it. Because there's nobody here. You can social distance here. You can avoid people when you're out in the countryside. And the way that a lot of police forces have behaved as a result of this pandemic is insane. Dropping dye into lakes, giving people on the spot £60 fines for sitting sunbathing. It's absolute insanity. And yet in Manchester there's a gangster funeral and it looked like there were thousands of people there. And Manchester's one of the hotspots. So what's going on? There's a lot of inconsistencies here. There's a lot of stuff going on that is sinister. The way that they're brainwashing people is sinister, and it is quite deliberate. They are using those techniques like neuro-linguistic programming, like the techniques from the persuasion and persuasion books by Robert Cialdini. They're using them because they work, and we must be aware that the government does that. I'm not saying that the government is wrong in doing the lockdown. I think it is now. I'm not saying it was in the first place. But I think they need to get a grip, and they need to start getting us out of lockdown and get the wheels of the economy moving before we all end up in debtor's prison. See you all soon.